Hello and welcome to the Rippling Pages podcast, where we craft and curate conversations with the world's most interesting writers to inspire your work. Now, what happens when the language you know can no longer carry your experience? It's a sweltering summer in Bretagne, France. Kay, an American exchange student, is navigating more than just unfamiliar streets. Kay is finding a new language. But in those silences, in the ellipses and mistranslations, a new way of seeing opens up. Kimberly Campanello is my guest today to talk about her book, Use the Words You Have. Kimberly is a poet and a professor of poetry, and Kimberly's work moves between forms, genres, and histories. Kimberly is the author of Mother Baby Home, a harrowing and formally innovative response to Ireland's mother and baby homes, and is held in the National Poetry Special Collections across the UK and Ireland. And Kimberly's poetry has appeared in publications like Granta, with essays in Tolka magazine, to name a few. This year, An Interesting Detail, a poetry collection, was released by Bloomsbury. But Use the Words You Have, published by Somesuch Editions, is Kimberly's first novel. Kimberly, welcome to the Rippling Pages podcast.
Thanks, Liam. Thanks for finally sitting down to talk to me and persisting, because it's, I feel like this is a conversation we've been meaning to have for quite a while. So it's great to have it.
There's a connection here, I guess. Is that we're both based in Leeds to some extent, but I spoke to Kimberly before about this, but my abiding memory of Kimberly is reading from Mother Baby Home, and powerful book, a book that creates a visceral response, which is all to say, Kimberly, I'm delighted to speak to.
No. I mean, I think the reason why I love that you brought that up, Mother Baby Home, is because actually it's really relevant to this book. Because I wrote this book coming out of the process of creating that book, which is addressing, the kind of lack of autonomy experienced, specifically erotic autonomy experienced by many women in Irish mother and baby homes, and indeed in those sorts of institutions worldwide. So because I finished that sort of project in 2019, this was the first thing I wrote after.
Oh, wow.
And it comes out of kind of sort of thinking through, I suppose, some aspects of my own experience, but some aspects of my own sense that, what would it be to write an alternative process of that period of time, and to indeed use the words you have. Because in Mother Baby Home, I only used words that were in other, archival materials, other people's voices. I didn't use any of my own words. I didn't create any words. So
Wow,
it's
that's so
it's
interesting.
really relevant. It's really interesting that you connected with that, and it sounds like you've also connected with this book. So it makes kind of sense to me in a way.
I mean, I guess it's my first image of you as a poet, and I know that and I've seen you perform your poetry, because this is, Use the Words You Have, is what some might call a more conventional novel, and you can pick it up, you can take it home, you can put it in your bag, which you can't do with Mother Baby Home. Where does the idea of the novel then, and we'll talk about what Use the Words You Have is about, but where does the novel sit then within your oeuvre?
I mean, I think one of the things that I was really inspired by, of course, the novel is written through the French language, and I had studied French in high school. I had lived abroad in Brittany in high school, and I also, studied French in college and spent a whole hours sort of reading all of Annie Ernaux, all of Marguerite Duras, all of Nathalie Sarraute, and all of the sort of French nouveau roman and autofiction. So I had read these sorts of novels that, you could say are highly autobiographical or what have you. But if you look sort of to even the 19th century novel, so many novels have that relationship. So what for me the novel was, and what this novel is that, I suppose, style of writing that is attempting to be to sort of give us a sense of what language can do to conjure story or to conjure setting and character, rather than creating them fully for you to sort of let wash over you. So it's a kind of immersive self-consciousness, I guess, is what I would say the nouveau roman does, and what a lot of sort of French autofiction does, is that it gives you all the elements of the novel, but in a way that's always kind of turning it into to remind you of capacity to create your own narrative and your own sort of atmosphere and your own language for those experiences. I think that for me, poetry does do that, but doesn't do it, with a character over a period of time. And so I think for me, I wanted to write something that I would actually want to read, uh, as a poet.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
that's kind of that was my first goal, I suppose.
So what is it then? Just maybe for listeners, what is then on the surface? Use the words you have about.
So on the surface, it's a
And I know
poet.
that surfaces challenge it, but perhaps
Yeah, it's
challenge you,
even like,
but
where do you begin with the story? But so on the surface, I suppose, or because there is a plot, despite it being a novel written by a poet, there is a story, there is a plot, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the character Kay is from the Midwest in America and goes on a not a study abroad experience, but a kind of immersive language experience where she lives for 6 weeks in the summer in Brittany in France. And she lives with a host family and then has an intense sort of relationship with the so-called host, and I have my fingers up, and host brother who is older than her, and she's 16 turning 17. And that experience of, the dislocation of being out of her kind of understood reality, both in terms of language, but in terms of day-to-day life, but also the way that culturally, young people are treated differently in different cultural contexts. And so that creates certain kinds of boldness or certain kinds of self-consciousness, depending on, what's going on and how you start to see yourself as well, because you're changing. Kay goes through this kind of grand amour, which becomes related, of course, to the learning of language or the use of language, but also to the landscape that she's in, because she just so happens to have been placed at this amazing, host family's house that's like right on a cliff looking over the Bay of Saint-Brieuc. So she gets to have that kind of linkage between, sexuality, language, and landscape. And in the meantime, she's only allowed to bring her English French dictionary, which she's supposed to use really irregularly. I can't remember what I have in there. I think it's once every 2 weeks or something, because she's supposed
yeah,
to do
she's
everything
banned, isn't
through
she? Banned.
French.
Yeah, yeah, banned from
Yes, because
bringing
she has to
away.
sign a contract, otherwise she will be sent home. And because it was very competitive to have this experience in high school. And so as a result, she has to think a lot through circumlocution and through kind of periphrasis and the ways that we learn language by talking around things.
And is that experience then of coming of age through language, is that different? Is that all of our experiences, or is that specific to Kay and who and an artist?
I mean, I think it's an interesting. Can I read you a little passage that does this? Because I
By all
think it
means,
would
yeah, yeah,
it would be
please.
really illustrative just to give a feel for. It's on page 9. So Kay's thinking about, she's had a kind of encounter or two with the host brother, and there are some rules, and so she talks about these and how she got there. Like when she was trying to explain her brother's minor crash last spring during a family mountain biking trip to the other students. Kay had needed something simple, the flat tire. But she didn't know tire and didn't know flat in that particular sense. So the wheels were going, then they were broken, but not broken. They were smashed, but not smashed. They were spread out. Not the wheels, the thing around the wheels with the air in it, soft and bouncy, and then suddenly tired and run over like that grass over there by the tree. See the grass? See how it is not standing up? See how it is low? So is the thing that is the wheel, but not the wheel that my brother had, the thing that made him fall. My brother, this brother, a hunger, a famine, faim, having a want, envy, envie, words within words in this language she must speak.
Thank you
So I
very much.
suppose it kind of shows a bit of that sense of how do you sound like you know what you're doing when you don't have the words and you can't even tell a simple story because you don't have the word for flat tire.
Interesting. So the idea of knowing then how is Kay getting banned? I guess how did you, and careful the words I use here, but translate that experience then into what is the effects that you're trying to create on the reader, which would be different to poetry in a novel.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it's the way that a novel can I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because even as I was about to say, a novel can put people in different points of view, but of course poems do that as well. So poems ask you to say, I did this, I did that, or you, or whatever. And so this does this a lot. Um, and speaks sometimes to a future Kay, speaks in first person to the past K, but also seems to be speaking to the lover in the book as well, or possibly the reader. And so I think it becomes that sense of the way that in telling any story, you're asking people to suspend their disbelief, but you're also asking them to participate in that kind of usage of words and usage of words to conjure. So when I think what you were saying about, what did you want the reader to experience, I think was how you said it. And I suppose is that kind of the building blocks of story, which is what a coming of age is. We all kind of think about that time in our life when we're coming into our own. Or in this book, and Kay is reflecting on it all the time, like, am I doing a good job at this? Like, does my coming of age look important enough to sort of hold my whole life? So I think it's that thing of trying to take the reader through that process, rather than simply putting Kay at arm's length and taking you through. It's kind of like you can be Kay for a little bit, looking for those words.
And I guess who is Kay then? Because I know you've used his name before, but I don't want to sound like a really simple question. Is Kay you? But what does Kay represent in this novel then? And you spoke about a very specific experience there. The brothers crashed last spring.
Yeah.
And it seems quite a specific memory, or was it the kind of play on the words tire and tie that led to that?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question because, the question, as I was speaking to earlier about autofiction, like, what is autofiction? If we think about, Marcel Proust wrote a very long novel for 3,000 pages in which there's a character that's remarkably like Marcel Proust. Kafka writes novels in which there's characters called K. Dante writes many long epics in which someone called Dante Alighieri, who's remarkably like Dante Alighieri. So I think that there's a kind of long tradition of writers using bits of their life. And if I was to pick apart like which bits are real and unreal or really happened or didn't happen, I think that would be an impossible task because there's so many things that have happened in language, So of course I'm constructing Kay's experience of language. And in some ways, my use of language is from my experience of it. So there's a relationship certainly there. But then you can't remember, I think, sometimes when you're a writer, like what are the things that were so, and what were the things that felt like they were so because of the words you heard at the time. So that's where you start to realize that, so much of the way we talk about memory is often a way of framing it. And especially I think for a lot of people, it's like we don't get to talk about memories in the way we might want to talk about them ourselves. And so they either get lost or they're told by others. And so I think it's that thing of, yes, of course, there's loads of things that are relevant to my life and that come from my life. But then there's also things that, as Kay is experiencing in her life, she's thinking about people reading her life. Now, whether that's the writing of her life or it's just the life itself, people judge, people think about how other people live, and their trajectories.
But what is that then? On some level, I believe this experience, Kay's experience, and in that instance that you just narrated, it's a great example of Kay being very unknowing.
Yeah, exactly.
And you seem to be hinting here toward there's a dilemma, perhaps for you as a writer or within literature and fiction, of the experience asks a lot of either the reader or the writer in being in a state of knowing.
You reach the end, and Kay, the sort of present day Kay or the present day Kays begin to revisit this period, and you become aware that that's part of how this story is being told, is by the revisiting of that period of time at a particular moment in time now. And that's something that Marguerite Duras does a lot. She rewrites the lover. So it begins as l'amant, the lover, and then later it becomes the North China lover, l'amant de la Chine du Nord, in part because a film is made about the lover that she doesn't like, and in part because the actual lover in her life, upon which all this is based, dies. Apparently, right? This is what's said. So I think there's also that sense of when you're sort of more upfront about saying this is related to life, or there is this character called Kay, then it demands that people think about what does it mean to revisit an experience? What does it mean to rework an experience? And I'm not saying it's a memoir. It's definitely not a memoir. It's not a work of nonfiction. Um, and I think that there's a line in it where I talk about it being a poem. So a lot of the book takes bits of 19th century French poetry, which is what Kay is reading, and uses that to patch together things to say. So people don't have to know that, but it's part of what gives it its both poetic but slightly strange quality is, what if all you have is one English French dictionary you can't use regularly, and then the complete works of Arthur Rimbaud, and you have to try to make sense of that, so there's my like duct tape
There we go. Yeah.
copy. So you have to kind of make yourself make sense with this very, very strange language from Arthur Rimbaud, who's
I mean, is that how you made sense of the world?
yeah, I
Or
mean,
the
I read
poet?
this. So this book, if you look inside, it says it was purchased in January 1995, Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Wow.
And so and it's obviously been read a few times.
It's a very significant. It's a significant object as much as it's a significant experience, isn't it? And I think about you as a writer then, and I guess how you related to the world. Did it come through people like Rimbaud and
Yeah. I mean, I was very nerdy because I because I was convinced that growing up in the Midwest, that everybody elsewhere, specifically in Europe, which includes, whether people like it or not, Britain. Um, and specifically in these places, everybody was so much more erudite because they had access to like all these books and all these museums and all these places that they could go, and they were mainly free, and education was accessible. And it was like, I mean, it was obviously like a problematic way to think, but I had that sense that I was somehow really isolated. And so I used to take the train to Chicago to go to Barnes and Noble because there's a big Barnes and Noble there. And then there were lots of little bookstores along the way, and I would go to the Art Institute. And this was when I was sort of 14, 15. And I was allowed to do that because it was like public transportation. And then I used to check out movies, from the public library in French, and then like tape our restaurants kind of coupon over the subtitles, because I was just convinced that I was like behind on everything.
oh
So in
wow.
part, it's like I do think I was, I became quite erudite, but it was because I was just afraid of that I was missing loads of things. In part because I started to read quite late, because I thought, when I was a kid, I thought reading meant you had to memorize it, or you had to write a story in your head and to make a story that matched the pictures. So
Wow.
once I had to start doing a test, that's how I got caught, because I was cheating. Because
Oh
I was like, it was like such a relief when I realized it was written down. Like,
yeah.
so I've always had this sense where, the sensory element of reading, or of the sense of like, oh, I have to make something really, out
Yeah.
of this. It goes back to early childhood, but not
I love
because I
that.
felt like I knew what I was doing. In fact, it was because I felt like I didn't know what I was doing.
I love that. I love that image. And considering what we've spoken about, we've spoken of conceptually and theoretically, and I just love this image of just someone who's incredibly interested and passionate about books, just trying
Mm.
to find, just trying to find books, just trying to find that experience.
Yeah, I mean, we had one bookshop in Elkhart, Indiana, that was called the Book Stack. And it was this really old bookshop run by this couple. And they had loads of amazing first editions and just stuff falling down. And I used to go and I bought all my books there. So like I bought really old copies of Walt Whitman, and I bought loads of Hemingway novels, but they were like really beautiful editions. I still
Mm.
have all them in my parents' basement. They'll probably be like, when are you going to come get those? But so it was like my experience of reading was very much about wandering around trying to get things, and then happenstance.
Mm.
So that's how I read Hart Crane, because there was a book of Hart Crane's poetry, and it was like, oh, what's this? I was like, oh God, this is really weird, you know. So I think we don't quite have that now, because it's controlled by algorithms, and it's controlled a lot by social media, but we don't have is that tactile experience as much, which is why our bookstores are so important, and our kind of, handing over of certain books to friends and posting things through the letterbox and the DIY scene. I think, that's really, really important, the tactile element.
Okay, yeah. I'll tell you what we'll do, Kimberly. We're gonna have a quick break on the ripping pages, but do come back. You come back, and all the listeners will come back, and we're going to talk more about use the words you have. Do you know that there is a Rippling Pages bookshop? It's not a real bookshop, but it's online and it's hosted by bookshop.org.uk. On there, you'll find all the books of Rippling Pages guests, which will include Kimberly Campanello's Use the Words You Have. To find it, go into the show notes, and all books are sourced from independent bookshops. And I also get a little commission from each book that I sell through there as well, which really does help me out and goes back into the running of the podcast. Okay, let's get back into it. Let's get back to Use the Words You Have with Kimberly Campanello. To the Rippling Pages, we're here talking to Kimberly Campanello about Use the Words You Have. Kimberly, let's get back into it. And I think so many people must relate to that. I relate to that. I'm just really curious and thinking about the book that you've written and Kay, and where were you reconnecting with that in writing this specific book?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, Kay, at one point is in Paris and she's like dragging her friends along on this pilgrimage. They go to the Beat Hotel, because of course she's like looked in the journals. I mean, it wasn't like I looked on the internet. It wasn't like Kay or someone in the 1990s called me, looked on the internet like, oh, where did they say? You had to actually read their journals to get the address, because there weren't even that many biographies of these people. I was always reading literary biography. So I think that sense of as well, always finding the books that no one else knows about, was a thing for me, because it was like, there's a bit where and I won't read much of it, but the sense of where Kay's talking about the scrapbook that she's told to bring to to the French family. She's told to make a scrapbook of herself and her family back in Indiana so that people can understand. And so she's really self-conscious about that. So she's attended the scene begins with her attending a Breton music class. So when it says the scrapbook has photos of Kay's Indiana family, house and dog, and information about her parents' occupations and what she likes to study and do in her spare time.
Look for the lines, the sharpness of it. She had wanted to leave America off the page entirely, which is it says a lot of things about that passage, but about what you're saying about Indiana and America and American literature. But I just love this. It's an accumulation of a consciousness, and it talks a lot about just these defenses we sort of create within ourselves about when we are just going to meet other. And I don't want to say the word, it's not innocence. It's just someone trying their best to come across in a positive way, or someone that's trying to engage in the culture. And that's why I find this really interesting, because it's a novel that you have written about some, dark themes. Mother Baby Home is incredibly harrowing on a level. But this is a novel that is, on some points, just somebody really trying their best to get by in the world and engage with a different culture in a really positive and fulfilling way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that sense of you can feel her sort of saying, listen, I know some things. I had to make a dumb scrapbook as if I'm like 12. But here I've made a really thoughtful sort of literary, I've made one with a point. But, good luck trying to figure out what that is. And of course, when it encounters Breton culture, it's then not at all what she thought, it was going to happen. And so she can't everything's more complex. And of course, Kay's realizing that things are far more complex, even as she's already sensed they are by reading. There's evidence for it now that you mainly get when you do step out, as you're saying, like step out of your usual and try. And then you find you get more complexity back. You don't get less, and I think that's the challenge of learning languages, living other places, which obviously Kay is doing from quite a privileged position. But obviously that's happening all the time, all over the world, and people making even minor efforts often meet serious complexity, and not in the nicest of ways, the way Kay's experienced things in a quite nice way. So it kind of echoes all those things. And I suppose is a kind of idealized way of presenting that. But I think that's okay, because, language can be fun. It doesn't just have to be destructive. And so I think that's part of what I was thinking when I was, as you say, hearkening back to those days when you're like in a bookshop and you're like, whoa, like this is all me, because in a way your books are around you to adorn you, to define you.
And there are lots of images in your work of language as can rupture things and break things apart. The language always seems to be this thing that breaks things apart, creates sometimes a kind of chaos. Here it's something that is constructing. It's a much more coherent process. Not all the time. There are some lines that don't allude to that, but it's Kay trying to cohere a narrative of the world, bring it together, as we just heard there, even if it is the scraps and the things, but she's trying to pull these scraps together into one thing, one book, I guess.
Yeah, and it won't be perfect. I mean, I think that was the thing that Bruce Omar Yates really picked up in his review in the London Magazine, where he talks about how a lot of it feels as though, because he's grown up in France and so he can hear some of the translated English. So a lot of it feels like a kind of wonky translation into English from French, because these experiences have happened in French. And it's that thing of, when you learn a language, it's all meant, you're supposed to be correct. But ultimately, he's talking about how what you get with Kay is this sense of, well, it's about, as you say, bringing the scraps together, however incorrect they are. Because if you wait till you're correct, you will never learn language. You'll never learn it. And if you continue to try to be perfect, then that becomes your personality. And I think in that language, so because everybody's slightly different in different languages. And so if your personality is, I'm always correct, I must be correct, which is what Kay has to let go, is a bit what I was describing. Like Indiana, I don't have to let this go, actually, because, oh, wait, Indiana is the Italian-American background. And maybe that's not quite so far away from the kind of ritual way of thinking that I'm actually going for, even if there are ways in which it diverges. So
yeah, and that's something we do from kids, isn't it? Something we do as kids is that we try and piece together this experience that is ultimately being shattered by being, isn't it? By being, and I don't maybe childlike is a cliche, but it is this real sense of Kay. Sometimes I have this image of Kay being really quite young, and then sometimes being quite old, and that's because you're trying to create different selves, I guess. But sometimes that scrapbook is a really lovely image, because it is, like you said, she's just been trying to be a 12-year-old putting a scrapbook together, or is Kay, there's something more serious about this.
It's a kind of literary sort of manifesto.
Yeah.
And I think, she kind of has that. There's some discussion about photographs of Arthur Rimbaud, and because he stops writing at sort of 21, and then he goes off and sells weapons and is responsible for a hell of a lot of terrible things in Africa. So, and in the Middle East. So, you kind of think, well, which one do you want to see? And so you're always wondering about not only the life you're making, but the way how it will play out. And I think that sense of which Kay are we looking at when is something that you do get in Duras as well. She begins the lover with I think the exact line is like, j'ai le visage détruit. I have, like, my face is destroyed, or I have a ravaged face, or there's ways to, but you can't really get quite in English how simple her language is and how kind of earth-shattering some of the phrases are in that book in particular. But it begins with that sense of the aftermath, which for her is a kind of a much more traumatic narrative than this, obviously. But I think it's that sense of looking at that particular time in one's life in the particular place, and that's where I really wanted to make it feel as the place, as that place.
Obviously, I speak to a lot of writers, and we say, "What's the book about?" And they'll tell me it's about this, that, and the other, and they do that, and we do that because people want to know what it's about. All these ideas must be cooking in, as they cook in my mind and stuff. But I just find it. I wonder how that. I just wonder how it was for you. Sitting down to write something.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Is that because you obviously you're a scholar and you're clearly just incredibly passionate about books and literature. And I guess how sitting down to the page. How are those ideas in your mind, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, this is where my notebook comes in.
Okay.
This is where my special notebook comes in, because it's my notebook, which I didn't use a notebook for a really long time because I was doing Mother Baby Home, which didn't require a notebook because it was very physically working with the archival material. But I'd been given this notebook, which is a Duffy's Bookbinders 5 Lamps notebook, which is an amazing place in Dublin, by a friend years ago. And I just started making boxes in it in August 2018. And that was when I did little boxes that looked like this. It's just like a box with some words, 2 words in it. The words are music festival, camping.
Okay.
And then the next box, les mensonges dans le livre de Rimbaud, the lies in the book of in Rimbaud's book. And then the next one says L'arrivée, the rival narrow streets versus la course, versus like a race. Le Mans 24, the car race. So that's pretty much some of the early scenes of the book. And that just continues. So there's like these boxes that are just like there. So that was August 2018, and that goes for a while. That goes for a few pages, or at least. And then I start making notes about point of view. First person, third person, I say a sparse, legendary, quote, legendary style, whether in first or third, not feverish or calculating. And then suggestive, symbolic, latent. So that's the kind of note. They're just very small notes. Then I have more, and including Brittany, words in Breton, like mon pote, which comes in, which means my friend, which is then taken into French. And then a rushed discussion of dawn, of aube. So some of it's in English and some of it's in French. So that just continues for several pages. And then that stops. And then it's like there's nothing for a while. And then suddenly I have like a lot of things written down. And that's when I wrote the whole book, was in 2019, was between sort of June 2019 and August 2019.
So it's these lines. I mean, is this how you'd start a poem? Or was this is a novel? This is going to be a novel.
I think it was going to be a novel. Yeah, no, I knew it was going to be a novel because I also write in the front, like where I'm using the notebook and when. Okay. So it says, that's how I know this. August 2018, start of Saint-Brieuc, because it was called Saint-Brieuc then, in Winlock Terrace, which is where I used to live in New York. And then it's like Jan to Feb 2019, some notes towards some poetry collaborations, and then nothing until June 2019, Saint-Brieuc. And then it tells you everywhere I wrote that over those couple of months. Okay. And so that's when I get the first draft. And so for me, this is like the actual sort of key of the whole book. Yes. Because I've got sort of the way I thought of it then, and then when I actually got to do it. And so the way I thought of it then was very much as you see in the book, like the scenes, the kind of scenes, or the kind of, they're not necessarily scenes, but they're kind of motifs, I suppose. So I wouldn't write a poem quite like that, because the poem would probably have been written by the time I figured out what was in that box.
But it is that boxy, which seems to translate a little bit to
the way the pages are.
The chunks of text.
And that's the only notebook for that book. That's it.
And do you use other notebooks for other books?
Yeah. So behind me, you see all the notebooks behind me. Those are everything ever since. So, there's another novel notebook behind me. And then there's, so I still use those notebooks. So my latest one is this color.
Interesting.
So I love the idea that they just fit perfectly on the same stack. But which Tony Harrison's notebooks are like that too. He used the same ones. We have his notebooks at Leeds.
Kimberly, I think this is quite a nice spot to bring our interview to a conversation to a close. It has been. I know you've got you're working on a translation of Dante.
Yeah, so it's a versioning of Dante that is really pulling out from, I think, my own subjectivity. I shall admit that it's my subjectivity, but trying to rework Dante's, sort of a long time since. It's been a long time since that was written, and yet some of the concerns are the same. So it's been a real pleasure to work through that whilst looking at this book again.
Well, you'll never be accused of an easy task.
No, but it's also fun. I think it's, in a way, I've got the placeholder text, right? I've got the structure. So, and reading, Kay again, use the words you have as we've been editing it, Susan and I, it's been like, aha, we can do this. So it's that thing of sometimes you write things so that you can do them.
Well, whatever it represents, you are a writer that is continually going to surprise and try new forms and shift and shape, but incredibly exciting one. And it has been my pleasure to have you on the Rippling Pages podcast, Kimberly. Thank you so much for being on the show. Use the words you have. It's out now and it's published by Somesuch Editions.
Thank you, Liam, for having me. It's been a pleasure.